All right, so normally the kids would depart now, and let me just talk to the kids real quick. You guys have been doing so good. My own daughter said this morning, "Mommy, I don't want to go to church. We have to just sit there the whole time." And normally she's like, "I want to go to church. I get to have my own class." You guys are doing so good, and I hope that soon we can return to the kids having their own time away as well. Thank you, Carl, for Bible bag. Again, thank you. Shaun, thank you for those worship songs this morning. All right, so the Gospel of Mark, that's where we've been for a little while now. And just real quick, some background on Mark again. When Mark writes his Gospel, he seems to have one thing in mind, one primary thing he's trying to guide us all to, and that is he's trying to get us personally, or his readers personally, to decide or to make a decision on who this Jesus is. And we talked about that the pivotal sort of peak of Mark's gospel is found in Mark chapter 8, where Jesus has this encounter with Peter, who would go on to be one of the most well-known apostles of all time. In that encounter where Jesus asked Peter, "Peter, who do you say that I am?" And the Gospel of Mark takes a turn right there and goes in a new direction as we walk toward the cross. So Mark's primary motive in writing what he writes is to bring the reader to a definitive decision who Jesus is. And so thus far we've learned that Jesus had authority over the demonic, okay, Jesus and the demoniac in chapter 1. We learned a couple weeks ago that Jesus had authority over disease, right? Last week, Jesus has authority over sin, right? Your sins are forgiven you. We talked about that last week. So all of this points to what we've said time and time again, that Jesus was not, this is what sets Christianity different than any other world religion, that Jesus was not a prophet come to tell us about God, as every other religion has. Prophets who come to tell us about God. Jesus was God, come to fulfill all the prophets. And that's a significant and very important difference. And so Mark's trying to get us to see that Jesus has authority, not just, he just doesn't just have, godly wisdom. He has authority over things only God has authority over. And so in today's lesson, we transition a bit, because today's story doesn't talk so much about what Jesus can do, but more importantly, who Jesus is in his person and in his heart. And so 3 things I want us to see from this story today. In verses 13 through 15, I want us to look at or to consider the tax collectors and sinners. In verse 16, I want us to consider the Scribes and Pharisees. In verse 17, I want us to consider the called. Who are the called? Okay. So tax collectors and sinners. We're actually not given a lot of detail in this story. Like, for instance, we know the name of this tax collector. His name is Levi, son of Alphaeus. We know he collects taxes in a tax collecting booth, which were probably conspicuously spread all throughout the Roman Empire. But we don't know anything about this man Levi other than his name, who he's the son of, and that he's a tax collector. All we know, that's all we know about him. Similarly, there are some scribes and Pharisees who enter the scene here, but we don't know anything about them either. We don't get any names or personal names of any of the scribes and Pharisees who were present. And so Mark here seems to be concerned not with the individual personalities involved in this encounter, because we don't get much of that information, but with the groups of people that these characters represent. And so these 2 groups are the tax collectors and sinners, the scribes and Pharisees. Okay, Levi represents the tax collectors and sinners. Scribes and Pharisees don't get any names, but they're there too. And so in the Bible, you'll find that these 2 groups are always linked. It's always the scribes and the Pharisees. It's always the tax collectors and sinners. Okay, they're always grouped together. And so I think that this is what Mark wants us to consider is these 2 groups of people. They represent 2 groups of people that actually no one wants to be like, but inevitably we find we are like. Okay, so no one wants to be a scribe or Pharisee. No one wants to be a tax collector or a sinner, because they're both hated. Okay, one is overtly hated for his immorality. The other is covertly hated for his superiority, and no one wants to be hated. Okay, and so I want to talk about these two groups of people, what they represent, and then I want to look at Jesus. So, tax collectors and sinners. We might say that tax collectors and sinners in the Bible represent people in society who do not pull their own weight. Okay, they have lifestyles that are overtly selfish. They are sinners, right? They are drunkards. They are addicts. They are the sexually immoral who live a free hippie lifestyle. They're prostitutes, things like that, right? These people know they are hated, but they would rather be hated overtly than hated covertly, like the Scribes and Pharisees are. All right, these people. There was not a tax collector in that day who did not know that he was a hated man. Tax collectors in that day were usually Jewish men who had colluded with the Roman government to exert taxes from their Jewish brethren. Therefore, they would have been considered by their Jewish brethren as traitors. Okay, you sold yourself to the Roman government. Tax collectors, different than today, got rich by their trade and were known to send troops to invade the homes of those who were allegedly withholding unreported goods. Okay? According to Wendy Rushling, Rome received its money in advance for the work the tax collectors did. Therefore, anything a tax collector collected beyond what they prepaid to Rome, they could pocket for themselves. And it could have been, honestly, that the Roman government paid their tax collectors so little that the tax collectors felt they had to exploit more than was required just to survive. So maybe it wasn't that they were getting rich, maybe some were, but maybe it was that the Roman government kept them so dependent that they had to exploit. Okay, so tax collecting, that system thrived on dishonesty, exploitation, overcharging, such that tax collecting and sinner became a synonymous term. So, like in the Bible, also you have a good Samaritan. Like, you didn't say that in ancient times. There was no such thing as a good Samaritan. And that's the kind of the amazingness of that Good Samaritan story. Well, in the same way, tax collectors and sinners. There was no good tax collector, just as there's no good sinners. Okay, so this is how they were viewed. So tax collectors were hated people, as were the sinners. But what Jesus saw through, and this is very important, what Jesus saw through was the fact that the lifestyles of tax collectors and sinners were lifestyles motivated by pain reduction. Jesus saw that the lifestyles of tax collectors and sinners were lifestyles motivated by pain reduction. So Jewish men probably became Roman tax collectors by threats to their life or the life of their family. In this way, we can assume that Levi was a tax collector not because it was fun, but because it was effective. Effective at what? Effective at preventing pain. Okay? In the same way, the sinners knew in their hearts that what they were doing was wrong, but they also knew that the way they lived life was effective at dulling their pain, right? So in other words, tax collectors and sinners did not actually believe that there was nothing wrong with what I do. Their argument was simply that what they were doing was momentarily successful at dulling their pain, and the momentary dulling of pain was better than living in pain perpetually. Okay? In fact, in Luke 18, when Jesus gives the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee praying in the temple, Jesus is very clear to say that this tax collector knew he was a sinner. Like, he knew he was. Jesus said the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." So tax collectors and sinners knew they were sinners, but their sin was motivated not by pleasure so much as by pain reduction. And there were probably some exceptions to that, but probably not many. Okay? So I'm glad the Bible is so outdated that these categories no longer apply to us. I hope you catch my sarcasm. These tax collectors and sinners represent a certain group of people in every society. Okay? So let me give you some examples. I remember the story of a young woman who was sitting in a counseling office in tears, confessing that she had recently engaged in an extramarital affair involving more than one man at the same time. And as she sat in the office, she was broken. She was ashamed. She was overcome with grief because she knew that what she had done was wrong. So why did she do it? Well, it was not because it promised her pleasure, but because it promised her pain reduction. Okay? You see, someone finally wanted her. Someone pursued her. Someone, for once in her life, was desirous of her. And that momentary relief from pain was better than the perpetual pain of loneliness and rejection that had been so common to her. So listen, if you are addicted to a substance today, you know that you are addicted not because it's fun, but because it's effective, right? People who drink or do drugs just for fun can usually put it down without issue. But those who become addicted can't. Why? Because they find that it's effective at dulling pain. And it's only secondarily fun, and it's only momentarily fun, right? So tax collectors and sinners knew they were wrong, but stopping was so hard for them because they thought, well, what's the alternative? Live in pain the rest of my life? Okay? Jesus saw through it and he said, the reason they're doing what they're doing is because they're in pain. Okay? So now another thing about tax collectors and sinners and who they represent is that at their core, tax collectors and sinners usually hate themselves. So it said the tax collector beat his breast and said, have mercy on me, a sinner, right? At their core, tax collectors and sinners and the people they represent usually hate themselves, and the rejection they receive in society because of what they do only reaffirms their self-hate. So why do they hate themselves? Two reasons. First of all, because this is the lie that the devil, a lie of the devil they've heard from as early as they can remember. So think about it. In any single home, you have children who are automatically tempted to look down on themselves, along with children who are automatically tempted to look down on others. And this is why the same upbringing often produces radically different outcomes for children. So for example, when two children experience the ugly divorce of their parents, it is very common for one child to be angry and bitter at one parent in particular, usually the parent they can see has more blame, okay? While the other child is not angry at either, but is filled with shame that perhaps if she had just been a better behaved child, her parents would not have divorced. And so the irony here is that the child who is angry is typically the more rebellious, problematic one behaviorally. And the child who is filled with shame has always been the more compliant one, and there you go. There's the deception from as early as we can remember, right? Tax collectors and sinners often hate themselves at their core, in part because that is the temptation they have faced from as early as they can remember. When something went wrong in their life, they almost always heard the whisper, what's wrong with you, Shaun? If God really loved you, he wouldn't have let that happen to you. Okay? And they hear that from as early as they can remember. Now, the second reason they hate themselves is because in an effort to dull those painful thoughts or painful memories, they have engaged in activities that only made things worse. Right? So a mother once told a son that no woman would ever want you, son, because of your behavior. And so when that boy was an adult, he shacked up with the first woman who wanted him, and behold, that sinful relationship only made things worse. Right? Or an alcoholic can't forgive himself of the past, and so he drinks to numb those thoughts, which only gives him new experiences to regret. Okay? So tax collectors and sinners hate themselves at their core because that is the lie the devil has told them from as early as they can remember, on top of the fact that their own sinful behavior only made it worse. And so when Jesus invites, as he does here, the tax collectors and sinners to follow him, okay, the response is one of shock. They're like, you want me? Jesus, you want me? And that was how some of the disciples responded when Jesus said, come follow me. Bang, they're up, gone. He wants me. Okay, it's shock. Now, okay, so that's the tax collectors and sinners and who they represent I believe. Now, the second group of people is the Scribes and Pharisees. The Scribes and Pharisees, if the tax collectors and sinners don't pull their own weight, the Scribes and Pharisees do. They're productive, they're driven, they're leaders, they're competent, qualified, committed. The Scribes and Pharisees were always highly educated. They were experts in the law, right? They represent the highly educated or the successful in business. They stay away from drugs and alcohol or any substance or activity that might enslave them, not because those things would not be fun, but because they cannot run the risk of appearing out of control. So Scribes and Pharisees live life in order, and they look down on people who do not. And so the Scribes and Pharisees live a very strict, religious rules type of life. Scribes and Pharisees can be very controlling in relationships. Like the wife of a Pharisee never loads the dishwasher the right way. Because there's a right way to do everything, right? And the husband of a Pharisee wife, always feels her judgment, things like that, right? So Scribes and Pharisees, different than tax collectors and sinners, they don't struggle with the temptation to hate themselves. They struggle with the temptation to hate others. Verse 16, they said to the disciples of Jesus, "How is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners?" Those people. How can he eat with them? Right? They look down on people. They don't struggle with depression or self-hate. They struggle with trusting others and judging others. Okay? And so rather than dwell on the past, Scribes and Pharisees are preoccupied with the future, and so they struggle with anxiety and fear. So think about it this way. Scribes and Pharisees are not driven by pain reduction, but by fear evasion. Scribes and Pharisees are not driven by pain reduction like tax collectors and sinners, but by fear evasion. Everything they do is in an effort to prepare for the future. They are diligent savers because they fear not having enough money. They are critical bosses and very hard on their employees because they fear failure. They fear their company might tank and they can't let that happen. They are very hard on their children because they fear their family spinning out of control. They believe God expects perfection, and therefore they have very high standards of behavior, very little grace for disobedience, and come across as cold and hard. Okay? They tend to be very impatient with the failures and shortcomings of others, and if they do not see their pride as their primary struggle, they may actually say, I don't really have any struggles. Okay? You see, tax collectors and sinners know they are sick and need a doctor. That's why they do what they do. But Scribes and Pharisees believe they need a doctor or that anything's actually wrong with them. Okay? Scribes and Pharisees are also very concerned with appearances. It doesn't matter if something is good. What matters is that it looks good. Okay? It's like Scribes and Pharisees are like the compost container on my counter. It's copper. It's got this really shiny copper lid. But open that thing up and take a whiff, and you're going to pass out. Okay? Jesus would call them, in Matthew 23, whitewashed tombs. You get the idea, right? Now, when Jesus invites a tax collector or sinner to follow him, the response is they feel shocked. Jesus wants me? But when Jesus invites a scribe or Pharisee to follow him, the response is one of offense. Why do I need to follow you? I'm doing quite well on my own. Don't suggest to me that I have an issue. You're the one with the issue, right? This is how they think. And so in this scene, Jesus doesn't even invite them. Why? Because they're not ready to come anyway, probably. Now, have you found yourself in this story yet? All of us can either identify as a tax collector and sinner, or we can identify as a scribe or Pharisee. And for me, I identify with the tax collectors and sinners. Why? Because I may be successful in the eyes of some, but I've had to be honest with myself over the years that my drive has often been more about my own pain reduction than about pleasing God. So I've had to repent often of doing what I do to feel better about myself than in a sincere effort to please my Savior. Okay? So I resonate with the tax collectors and sinners, and as a result, I often feel shocked that Jesus would say, Shaun, come follow me. Me? Okay? That's my struggle, that God could love me. Okay? Now, so a way to assess yourself right now is ask yourself this. Do I find it harder to forgive others when they hurt me? Or do I find it harder to forgive myself when I hurt someone? And so if you find it harder to forgive yourself, then you're probably a tax collector and sinner. But if you find it harder to forgive others, you're probably a scribe or Pharisee. And as I said earlier, we don't want to be either because both are hated. One is overtly hated for his immorality, the other is covertly hated for his superiority, and no one wants to be hated. All right, so okay, let me go on a rant for a second, and I hope you see a political application to this too, because if we're honest, the Democrats tend to reflect the tax collectors and sinners, Republicans tend to reflect the scribes and Pharisees. So Democrats are generally very accepting of any morality you wish to engage in, not because they believe all pleasure is good, but because they know pleasure is an effective way of dealing with pain, and pain reduction is the goal of life. Okay? They're also strong advocates for medicine. And they have a mental health perspective that is almost completely medicinal because they know medicine reduces pain most effectively. Okay? They believe that the breakdown of the environment is the major problem in the world and not the morality of mankind. Why? Because they see that mankind chooses their morality in order to deal with the pain of life, and this is acceptable. Okay? They believe bringing, for example, unplanned children into the world would create more pain in the world, so rather than take responsibility for their morality, because morality is about pain reduction, the lesser of the pains in their minds is just to end the life of the unborn. Okay? They also believe that we should be soft on criminals in general because criminals only do what they do to deal with their own pain, and again, pain reduction is the goal of life. Now, Republicans, on the other hand, tend to reflect the scribes and Pharisees. They believe in order and structure. They're strong advocates for business. They're against taxing corporations or taxing the rich because the corporations and the rich are the ones who pull their weight, and why should we penalize those who pull their weight? Okay? They tend to look down on others while failing to see the pride in their own hearts. They're planners. They believe in mutual funds, 401ks, the stock market. Everything they do is about fear evasion, preparing for the future. They believe the law should be hard on criminals, not soft, because if we let these guys get away with it, we'll have a lot more problems in the future. Now, here's what we need to see. All right, there's my rant, political rant. It's possible for a tax collector and sinner to become a scribe or Pharisee and vice versa. How's that happen? Well, if a tax collector and sinner remain in their sin long enough and refuse to heed Jesus' call to come follow me, they can get to a place where they actually believe that their lifestyle is not about pain reduction, but about identity expression. This is who I am. Okay? And this is in part what has happened with homosexuality and transgender across the world. 30 years ago, people were honest to say, this is not pleasure for me, it's pain reduction. I need love. I haven't had love. This takes away my pain of loneliness and rejection. That was honest. Okay? But today, we are less willing to admit this, and so we say, no, there's nothing wrong. This is me. Okay? And so we look down as a result. The former tax collectors and sinners now look down on anyone who does not agree with them. We no longer see anything wrong with ourselves, but we can sniff out any fault in everyone else, which is formerly something only the scribes and Pharisees did. Okay? Ironically, life is no longer, at this point, about pain reduction, but about fear evasion. And the biggest thing we fear is being found out. Maybe I'm not this. Okay? We also begin to be consumed with appearances, while inside we are full of dead men's bones and hatred toward others not like us or who don't agree with us. You see how the transition? Now, a scribe and Pharisee can become a tax collector and sinner too, and this isn't any better. If your anxiety and desire to control and bitterness at the world become strong enough, you will find yourself attracted to anything that promises to take away the pain of your fear. Have enough panic attacks and you'll be looking for something to stop them, right? And here's where that leads. You begin to do things you told yourself you would never do. You begin to drink. You begin to do drugs. You begin to lie, cheat, and steal just to gain your stash, because now life has become about pain reduction. The reduction of the pain of my fear. That's overwhelming to me, right? And now instead of looking down on others for all the bad they have done, which is what you used to do, you become so disgusted with yourself for doing the things you said you would never do, and you get to the point of wanting to take your own life. And now you're a tax collector and sinner, or at least you know what they feel. Okay? And here's what we need to see in this rant of mine. Jesus calls both the tax collector and sinner, as well as the scribe and the Pharisee, to repent and come follow me. All right, so we see the tax collectors and sinners, scribes and Pharisees. I want to talk last thing, I'll close talking about the called. In verse 17, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Right? So during this COVID-19 pandemic, many people have had to watch their family members die in isolation. Okay, this is a reality we never thought we would face. So since the majority of deaths have happened in senior care facilities, and those senior care facilities says no one can come in, people are dying in isolation. Okay, and I heard one particular story where the mother passed away in your senior care facility, and the daughter, as a way to avoid dealing with the deep grief in her heart for not being able to be with her mother in her last days, as a result of this, she avoids going to the graveside, and she avoids talking about her grief. Why? Because in dealing this way, she can almost convince herself that her mother is still alive. She thinks that if she does not say out loud, "Mom is dead," and if she does not visit the graveside, it almost feels like she just hasn't seen her in a while. But she knows, and we know, that just because I do not admit something does not mean it's not real. When Jesus said it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick, he was not saying that the scribes and Pharisees were healthy. The scribes and Pharisees were like the woman who refused to talk about her grief and refused to go to the grave. They lived by the illusion that all was well with them, but just because I don't admit that I'm sick does not mean I'm healthy. Okay? The scribes and Pharisees were not yet ready to be called by Jesus, because they were not yet willing to admit or see their need. Okay? And so if you're a scribe and Pharisee today, your obstacle in hearing Jesus' call is the illusion that you've created for yourself that you do not need anything that you do not have your own ability to provide. The scribes and Pharisees are offended when Jesus calls them to follow him because they do not see themselves gaining from following him. What will Jesus provide me that I don't already have in myself? In this way, folks, they don't see how very sick they are. They are those people who depend on their own righteousness and not that of Jesus. And so Paul the Apostle, probably the most famous Pharisee ever, had to be flattened before he responded to Jesus' call to follow him. Okay? But Jesus still called him. And the same is true today. If you're a scribe and Pharisee, you may need to experience a failure or go bankrupt or battle an addiction before that you need a doctor, and that maybe Jesus, and that need, that awareness, maybe Jesus' way of calling you. Okay? But the tax collectors and sinners, the ones Jesus calls and dines with, openly admit that they need something they do not have power to provide on their own. And so in our beloved city today, we have groups of people on both sides of this coin, and Jesus is calling them all. And if Jesus is willing to dine with any who will admit they are sick and need a doctor, then we need to be willing to dine with any who are sick, who admit they are sick and need a doctor as well. We need to be willing to dine with the addicts. We need to be willing to dine with the prostitutes. We need to be willing to dine with the sexually immoral. We need to be willing to dine with those people who are overtly hated for their behavior, because we need to see deep enough to know that what they do to relieve their pain.
Amen.
Okay. In the same way, we need to be willing to call the proud to be honest with themselves and admit their need. One question I'll often ask in counseling is, so tell me, to a Pharisee, or someone I've discerned to be a Pharisee over time, so tell me what you actually have control over. That's usually a short conversation, because when we actually think about it, well, my behavior, do you really have control of your own behavior? Aren't there times when you do the good, the bad you don't want to do, and you don't do the good you do? Oh yeah, I guess I don't even have control over that. So when we ask the question, well, we actually have control over it so little. We need to be willing as well to call the proud to be honest with themselves and admit their need. We need to be about every day seeking one person to call to dine with Jesus, regardless if they are a tax collector and sinner or a scribe and a Pharisee. And folks, this is who Jesus is. He desires to be everybody's pain reliever, and he desires to be everybody's fear abater. And so as we prepare to surround communion right now, let me ask you, who are you? Where do you fit in this story? Are you a scribe and a Pharisee? Are you a tax collector and a sinner? Whoever you are, you need to know that Jesus eagerly desires to dine with you. Okay. Jesus desires to relieve your pain, and Jesus desires to still your fear, but you must respond to his call to come follow me. Okay. You must admit that you're sick. You must admit that you cannot save yourself. You must admit that all of your righteousness and good living won't hold water in the end. Okay. You need Jesus to make you righteous before you can ever be righteous. And so if you're in pain today, then come to Jesus as we commune. Kneel up here. I want to come and talk to myself or to Al or another person here you feel comfortable with about what is your next step. Okay? If you're living in fear, then come to Jesus as we commune as well. Are you willing to dine with tax collectors and sinners in Laconia? Are you willing to call the scribes and the Pharisees to be honest with themselves? May we be a church who seeks one person every day to respond to Jesus' call. So what is your next step as a scribe or a Pharisee, as a tax collector or sinner? We're going to stand here in just a moment and we'll form two lines and we'll space out into family groups, and you come and take your communion cup with the wafer on top, and if it's appropriate for you, spend some time at the front. Or come talk to me, come talk to Al. Help us discern your next step together. Let's stand and let's take communion as the music plays.